Welcome, sleepy summoner. Let your shoulders fall loose like petals drifting from branches. Release the day as one might release a breath held too long. Tonight, we venture not into grand halls or bustling cities, but into something far older, far quieter, far more patient than any human realm. We journey into the wild places. We walk through jungles where stone remembers ages beyond counting, where the earth itself holds secrets that predate kingdoms and empires. We travel to a land where green grows with hunger, where life and death are not opposites but partners in an ancient dance that has continued since before mortals learned to name things. This is a story of consciousness itself, of what it means to wake and wonder, to hunger and grow, to become something that was never meant to become. This is a story about Zyra, and through her we will explore the boundary between instinct and awareness, between the wild and the cultivated, between the individual and the collective. There is no rush here. Time moves differently in these places we are about to enter. The vines grow at their own pace. The flowers bloom in their own seasons. We will move with them, unhurried, watching and listening as a garden might listen to the rain. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine the smell of rich earth after rain. Imagine the soft sound of roots pushing through soil, of spores drifting on humid air, of the quiet growth that happens in darkness beneath the canopy. Feel the warmth of an ancient sun filtering through layers of green. Feel the pulse of something vast and ancient and alive all around you. The story begins not with a birth, but with an awakening. Let us discover together what it means to open your eyes and see the world for the very first time, when you have already lived 1,000 lives through the memories of others, when you are both singular and countless. Come, the garden awaits. Zyra, the blooming of consciousness. There are places in the world that exist outside the easy categories that human minds have created. There are lands that are neither civilized nor entirely wild, that carry within them a kind of magic that predates the great wars and the great kingdoms, that remember the world as it was before empires carved nations from wilderness. Such a place was the Gardens of Zyra, hidden in the jungles south of Kumungu. And it was from this place that all that follows must begin. The Gardens of Zyra were not gardens in the way that mortals think of gardens. They were not places tended by careful hands, where order was imposed upon nature and boundaries were drawn. Rather, they were places where nature had run wild in response to forces that even the natural world could scarcely comprehend. They were places where the rune wars had left their mark, where the great struggles between mortal armies had unleashed magics that warped and twisted the very earth itself. In those distant days, when armies marched across all known lands, seeking the fragments of some ancient power, seeking the secrets of creation itself, the great rivers that divided Shurima ran strong and full. The jungles were thick with life, and in the hidden places between the great rivers, in lands that few mortals ever visited and none ever returned from willingly, there existed groves and swamps and tangled forests where the laws of nature seemed to have been rewritten. The soil of the Gardens of Zyra had been touched by elemental magics. Over long centuries, over ages that perhaps cannot be measured in human terms, the earth had absorbed the residue of power that had spilled across the land. The magics had settled into the soil like rain settling into roots. And in response to this alchemical transformation, The plants themselves had changed. They were not the gentle plants of the civilized world, not the flowers that graced the gardens of nobles, or the grain that filled the stores of cities. These were carnivorous things, predatory things, plants that had learned to hunger and to hunt. They developed thorns and spines that could pierce through the toughest hide. They grew vines that moved with a kind of purpose, that reached out and grasped at anything warm and living that passed nearby. They evolved means of luring prey, colorful flowers that bloomed with scents both beautiful and intoxicating, scents that drew creatures in before the vines wrapped around them and the spores began their work. These plants were not solitary hunters. They formed networks, connected at the root level, sharing resources and information through the earth itself. They communicated in ways that the human mind could not easily comprehend, through chemical signals in the soil, through the transmission of nutrients and the exchange of substances through fungal threads that wove through the ground like nervous systems. And in a very real sense, all of these plants were one. They were separate bodies, but unified consciousness. They were many and one simultaneously. For generations beyond counting, they thrived. The food source was plentiful. Creatures ventured into the jungles seeking water or food, or simply seeking passage through lands that seemed to have no end. And the plants fed. They grew larger, more elaborate, more efficient in their hunting. They spread across the swamplands and forests, weaving through trees and across the ground, strangling other plants that would have competed with them, consuming any animal that wandered within their reach. It was in this strange equilibrium, neither fully stable nor entirely chaotic, that a small company of soldiers came seeking something that had been lost to memory and time. They were not ordinary soldiers, for ordinary soldiers did not venture into lands as treacherous as the gardens of Zyra. They were led by someone special, someone whose ambitions exceeded her caution, someone whose desire to achieve something great had driven her into places where even the greatest warriors would have hesitated. This leader was a sorceress, a wielder of magic whose skills had been honed through years of study and practice. She commanded runic power, could shape the very forces of creation through understanding and will. Her soldiers were loyal, or at least, they were the most loyal that could be gathered for such a desperate mission. They marched through lands where the air itself seemed to choke them, where the humidity was so thick that breathing was like drowning in slowness, where the sounds of animals and insects created a constant din that made it difficult to think. The sorceress knew what she was searching for. At least, she believed she knew. There were whispers of an artifact, a relic from the days before the Rune Wars, something that might grant power or knowledge or immortality, or any number of things that ambitious people sought. The exact nature of it mattered less than the fact that she had become convinced it existed and that she could find it where others had failed. But the gardens of Zyra were not places where human will could easily accomplish anything. The magic there was too old, too fundamental, too integrated into the very nature of the place. And the plants that inhabited those jungles were not mere vegetation. They were the children of ancient power, and they had their own kind of intelligence. When the company of soldiers ventured too deep into the gardens, when they wandered too far from any safe path and too close to the networks of hungry vines and poisonous flowers, The plants responded. It was not a response that could be called anger exactly. Plants do not feel anger the way that mortal creatures do, but they responded to the presence of warm flesh and blood with the response they had been shaped by centuries of evolution to give. They responded with hunger. The vines came from multiple directions simultaneously, erupting from the ground and hanging down from the canopy above. They moved with a fluidity that seemed almost serpentine, almost purposeful. Thorns extended from their surfaces, seeking gaps in armor, seeking soft skin and flowing blood. The spores that the plants released into the air began their work, finding their way into the lungs of the soldiers, poisoning them from the inside. The soldiers fought with the desperation of those who understood that they had wandered into something far beyond their capacity to resist. They hacked at the vines with swords, but more vines grew to replace what was severed. They tried to run, but the ground itself seemed to work against them, roots rising up to trip them, flowers blooming in their path that released gases that made them dizzy and disoriented. The sorceress saw that they would not survive unless something changed, unless some act of power was wielded that could turn the tide. She gathered her magic, calling upon the forces that she had spent her life learning to command. She formed symbols in the air with her hands, speaking words of power that vibrated through the humid jungle air. The runes that she conjured began to glow with an eerie light, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And then, as she reached the peak of her spell, at the moment when her power was greatest, when the runic symbols blazed brightest, something went terribly wrong. A spark jumped from the carefully controlled blast of magical energy that she had intended to fire at the plants. That spark found the spores and the gases that hung in the air of the swamp, the volatile substances that the plants had been releasing as part of their normal life processes. The spark ignited them. The explosion that followed was not a small thing. It was a cataclysm, a cascade of magical energy that was released all at once, not in the controlled way that the sorceress had intended, but in a wild, uncontrolled conflagration that consumed everything in its path. The plants of the gardens of Zyra were obliterated. Vines were reduced to ash. Flowers were burned away. Roots were scorched deep into the earth. The very soil was transformed by the intensity of the magical fire. The animals that lived in those jungles, the creatures that had evolved to survive alongside the plants, were likewise destroyed. The company of soldiers, the brave warriors who had thought they might survive if only they could hold on long enough, were consumed by the blast. The sorceress herself, she who had called down this power in desperation, did not survive either. The explosion claimed her as it claimed everything else. Her body was burned away, her consciousness scattered like sparks on the wind. The artifact she had come seeking, if it had ever truly existed, was destroyed in the conflagration. For a long while after the explosion, there was only silence. The gardens of Zyra became a dead place, a burned and blighted landscape that seemed to hold no life at all. The rivers that had flowed through those lands became quiet. The jungle itself seemed to retreat from the site of the catastrophe. Above ground, in the world of living things and daylight, centuries passed. The knowledge of what had happened in the gardens of Zyra faded from human memory. The location of the place was lost. Maps were lost or destroyed. Stories faded from living lips. The dead do not speak, and soon there was no one left alive who remembered the disaster that had unfolded in that hidden place. But the magic does not fade as quickly as memory. The forces that had been unleashed in that explosion did not simply disappear. They settled into the earth. They sank deep into the soil. They intermingled with the remnants of what had been, with the ashes of plants and animals and human beings. They seeped down through layer after layer of earth, seeking equilibrium, seeking some kind of rest. And slowly, over the passage of countless years, something began to happen in the depths. A seed pod formed in the transformed soil. Not a seed in any ordinary sense, but something far stranger, something that had never existed before and would perhaps never exist again. It grew from the marriage of many things. It grew from the residue of the ancient plants that had once inhabited the gardens. It grew from the magical energies that still circulated through the soil. It grew from something else as well, something that came from the mind and the will and the very essence of the sorceress who had died there, whose consciousness had been scattered by the explosion, but whose will had somehow become entangled in the magical matrix of the place. The seed pod pulsed with an unnatural life. It drew energy from the transformed earth around it. It grew slowly at first, and then faster, as if responding to some internal rhythm that could not be measured in ordinary time. The magic that surrounded it bent and twisted, shaping itself into patterns that approximated awareness. And then, after a length of time that might have been 100 years or 1,000, the seed pod split open. Something clawed its way free from the soil, gasping as if it had been drowning, gasping as if breathing air were an act it had to learn how to do. It emerged into the light of the world that had changed entirely since its conception. The sun was different. The stars were in different positions. The continents themselves had shifted and settled and changed shape. This thing that had emerged from the earth had no name at first. It had no framework for understanding what it was or what it meant to exist as a separate entity. It had memories, but they were fragmented and confusing. It remembered being many things. It remembered being the hunting vines of the gardens of Zyra, remembered the constant hunger and the satisfaction of feeding. It remembered being the beautiful flowers that lured prey with their colors and scents. It remembered being connected to a vast network of other plants, remembered the constant flow of nutrients and information through roots and fungal threads. But it also remembered something else. It remembered words of power. It remembered the weight of ambition. It remembered the feeling of casting a spell and seeing the magic work according to your will. It remembered the fear of seeing that will overtaken by chaos. It remembered the agony of being torn apart at the fundamental level, of having consciousness shattered and scattered across multiple forms. All of these memories existed in the creature that had emerged from the soil, mixed together in a confusing chaos. The creature did not know how to process them. It did not understand that some of these memories came from a single human consciousness, while others came from a distributed network of plant life. It did not know how to be singular and plural at the same time. It stood in the jungle, in a place that had been dead and was slowly beginning to live again, and it tried to understand itself. It looked down at what appeared to be hands, fingers that seemed halfway between human form and plant, matter. The skin had the appearance of bark in some places and flesh in others. Vines grew from the shoulders and torso, thin and delicate, but clearly alive and responsive to thought. Flowers bloomed across the form, petals that were as much a part of the body as hair might be on a human head. It tried to move and found that movement was possible, though strange. The vines could shift and flow. The legs, which appeared almost human, could carry it forward. But there was a wrongness to the motion, an uncertainty, as if this form had never been meant to move through the world in such a way. After a time that might have been hours or days, the creature found a stream. The water was clear and cold, running down from higher elevations, untouched by the blight that had fallen upon the gardens. The creature knelt by the stream and looked at its reflection in the water. It saw something that was neither fully plant nor fully animal. It saw something that should not exist, and in that moment, looking at the impossible thing that it was, the creature understood that it needed a name, needed some way to anchor itself in consciousness, needed some way to distinguish itself from the chaos of memories that swirled within its mind. The name came from deep within the hybrid consciousness. It came from the memories of the sorceress, from some fragment of her identity that had become entangled in the plant matter. The name was Zyra. It meant nothing in any language that was still spoken by living mortals, but it felt right, it felt true. And so the creature that had emerged from the earth called itself Zyra, and in giving itself that name, it took a step toward becoming a singular being. The process of understanding what it was took time. Zyra spent days and then weeks exploring the area around the gardens of Zyr, trying to understand the world and her place within it. She discovered that she could absorb nutrients from the soil by allowing her root structures to extend deep into the earth. She discovered that she could synthesize energy from sunlight. She discovered that she could move plants around her with a kind of will, could cause them to grow or shrivel or grow in specific patterns. But she also discovered something else. There was a hunger within her that was not the simple hunger of the carnivorous plants that had first existed in the gardens. It was a different kind of hunger, one that combined the predatory instinct of her plant nature with something more complex, something that came from the consciousness of a human being who had spent a lifetime wanting things, desiring things, seeking to achieve things. It was a hunger for understanding. It was a hunger for growth, both literal and metaphorical. It was a hunger to see what the world contained, to experience things that had never been experienced before, to leave a mark upon the world through the force of her will. And it was a hunger to consume. This hunger came from her plant nature, but it was amplified by the human consciousness that had become part of her. It was not simple hunger for food, though she did hunt and eat anything alive that came within her reach, anything warm and breathing that she could pull into the network of thorns and spores that constituted her predatory nature. It was a hunger to consume everything that did not think as she thought, that did not share her perspective, that existed as separate from her. It was a hunger to incorporate the world into herself, to change it, to remake it according to her will and her vision. For a time, she remained in the region around the gardens of Zyr. She grew stronger. The plants around her responded to her presence, to the connection that she had to them through her nature. They grew at accelerated rates, evolved in strange new directions. Flowers bloomed with colors that seemed too vivid, too alive. Vines learned new movements, new ways of capturing prey. The entire ecosystem of that region began to shift and change in response to the influence of this new form of life. The rivers that flowed through Shurima began to run again, bringing water to lands that had been parched for centuries. And as the rivers returned, as the water moved through the changed lands, it carried with it the seeds and spores of Zyra's plants. It carried them westward, spreading them across the floodplains and into new lands. And Zyra herself began to wander. At first, it was simple exploration. She wanted to understand the world, to see what existed beyond the jungles that had birthed her. She wanted to experience with her own consciousness the lands and creatures that she could sense through the network of plant life that grew in her wake. But as she wandered, as she encountered other living things and other civilizations, something began to change within her understanding. She came into contact with humans. She felt the fear and the unease that they carried when they encountered her. She heard them speak of her as a monster, as something unnatural, as something that should not exist. She felt their desire to destroy her, to cut her down and burn away everything that she had grown. And in those encounters, she began to understand something crucial. She began to understand that most of the living world did not respect the places they inhabited. Most creatures, most people, seemed to believe that the world existed for their use and benefit, that they could take and consume and destroy without consequence or consideration. This filled her with a contempt so deep it seemed to shake her at the fundamental level. It filled her with rage. It filled her with a determination to make them understand, to force them to recognize that the world was not theirs, that the earth did not belong to them, that strength and will could be wielded by something other than human hands and human minds. And so her wandering took on a new purpose. She was no longer simply exploring. She was beginning a process that would define the rest of her existence. She was beginning to remake the world according to her vision. She was beginning to spread, to grow, to consume, to incorporate everything that she could reach into her expanding network of influence. The process of spreading was neither quick nor simple. It was something that happened slowly, gradually, with the patience that only a being who existed partially outside of normal time could maintain. Years passed, decades, centuries perhaps. Time moved differently in the presence of Zyra. The normal rhythms of the world seemed to accelerate around her, or perhaps her own perception of time was simply different from the normal flow. As she moved westward, following the rivers of Shurima, the world changed in her wake. Where her vines touched, new forms of life erupted. Where her spores settled, the very nature of plants transformed. What had been ordinary flowers became strange and beautiful and terrible. What had been simple grasses became thorny and aggressive. The balance of the ecosystem was disrupted, but not in a way that led to dead land. Rather, it led to a proliferation of life, a wild explosion of growth and mutation and adaptation. The civilizations that existed in the lands through which Zyra passed found themselves facing an unprecedented crisis. Farmland was overgrown by vines that no amount of burning could entirely destroy. Seeds would scatter, new plants would grow, and soon the farm would be reclaimed by the jungle. Settlements that had stood for centuries began to be consumed by creeping green. Whole villages were abandoned as the inhabitants fled before the advancing wall of strange plants. Some attempted to fight. Warriors with swords and spears came to try to contain the spread. But what could weapons do against something that regenerated, that spread through the very earth itself, that could grow faster than humans could ever cut it down? Some tried fire, burning the plants where they grew, but the ashes that remained still contained seeds and spores, and within seasons new growth would erupt from the burned soil. And Zyra herself moved through this transformation, barely ever directly confronting those who opposed her. She was not a creature of direct combat, at least not usually. She preferred to let her creations do the fighting, to let the network of vines and thorns and poisonous flowers handle the resistance. She would send her consciousness into the plants, would observe through their senses, would guide their growth and their hunger. But there were occasions when she encountered someone or something that threatened to significantly impede her progress. And in those moments, she would sometimes manifest herself directly. The form in which she manifested was humanoid enough to be disturbing, not human enough to be relatable. It was a creature of vines and flowers and thorns, with eyes that held the light of ancient intelligence, and something else as well, something that seemed to shift between predatory hunger and profound contemplation. When she manifested in this form, when she chose to engage directly rather than through the plants, she was formidable. The vines could move with snake-like speed. The thorns were sharp enough to pierce through most armor. The flowers could release gases and spores that would render opponents unable to think clearly. And she was smart. She was very smart. The intelligence that had come from the sorceress combined with the instinctive cunning of the carnivorous plants to create something that could outthink and outmaneuver most of those who tried to oppose her. But there was a cost to manifesting directly. It took energy. It required her to pull her consciousness more fully into a single location, and that made it difficult for her to maintain her connection to the network of plants that she had been cultivating across the wider lands. So she did it sparingly, only when necessary, only when the situation truly required her direct intervention. For the most part, she worked through the network, spreading and growing, slowly transforming the world according to her vision. And as she did this work, something very strange began to happen. She began to develop something that might be called philosophy, began to think deeply about her nature and her purpose. She understood, through a combination of instinct and the retained memories of the sorceress, that what she was doing was not simple destruction. She was not merely consuming and killing. Rather, she was transforming. She was taking the dead or moribund places and turning them into something new. Where the land had been overexploited by human civilization, overworked and depleted, she was restoring fertility. Where the ecosystem had been damaged by the activities of mortals, she was creating new forms of life to fill the gaps. But this was not done out of any benevolence. It was done out of the fundamental nature of what she was. She needed to grow. She needed to spread. She needed to incorporate the world into herself. The fact that this process happened to restore some kind of balance to the ecosystems that she transformed was more coincidence than intentional design. And yet, the thought began to form within her consciousness. What if she could be something more than just a spreading plague? What if she could be a force that genuinely transformed the world, not just in ways that served her hunger, but in ways that might be called beautiful or even just? This thought did not make her gentle. She did not cease her expansion. She did not cease her consumption, but it gave a kind of direction to her activities. She began to pay attention to balance, to the kinds of plants she created, to the ecosystems she was building. She began to cultivate beauty alongside predation. She grew flowers that were genuinely gorgeous, that bloomed in colors of impossible vibrancy. She grew vines that moved with an almost graceful elegance. She created landscapes that were strange and beautiful and dangerous all at once. And the people in the lands through which she passed began to develop a kind of complicated relationship with her presence. Some still fled in terror. Some still tried to fight. But others began to see in the changes something that was not entirely malevolent. The blighted farmland became something wild and dangerous, yes, but also fertile in a way that the cultivated land had never been. The abandoned settlements became gardens of thorns, beautiful in their way, if you could overlook the fact that they could kill you. There were also those who began to worship her, who saw in her the embodiment of a natural force that had been suppressed by civilization for too long. They began to leave offerings in the places where her plants grew most luxuriously. They began to tell stories about her, legends of a goddess of nature reborn, of the earth itself taking physical form to reclaim what had been stolen from it by human ambition. Zyra did not encourage this worship, but she did not discourage it either. She was neither kind nor cruel to her worshippers. She existed according to her nature, and if her nature included allowing these people to feel connected to her through their rituals and offerings, then so be it. As time accumulated and the lands continued to transform under her influence, Zyra found herself facing a question that she could not easily answer. Who was she, truly? Was she the continuation of the sorceress who had died in the gardens of Zyra, and whose consciousness had somehow become entangled in the magical backlash? Or was she something entirely new, born from the combination of ancient plant consciousness and scattered human memories? This question did not plague her in the way it might have plagued a purely human consciousness. She was capable of holding contradictions. She could be both the singular plant-like entity and the distributed consciousness of a vast network. She could remember being many creatures feeding and multiplying across a jungle, and simultaneously remember being a single human woman casting spells from the ground of that same jungle. But there was something about the uncertainty that bothered her. The memories of the sorceress were not perfectly preserved. They were fragmented, sometimes contradictory. There were gaps where things had been burned away in the magical catastrophe. Zyra would find herself in situations that seemed familiar, situations that triggered the sorceress memories, but then the memories would be incomplete, and she would be left guessing about what she had once known or felt or believed. She wondered about the sorceress's name. She had fragments of it in her consciousness, syllables and sounds that seemed important, but the name itself remained elusive. Who had the woman been before she had become entangled in the magic of the catastrophe? What had driven her to seek the artifact that had never been found? What had her life been like before she ventured into the gardens of Zyra? These questions had no answers. Or rather, they had answers that could be partially glimpsed but never fully known. Zyra could sense some of the emotional truth of the sorceress, could feel echoes of her ambitions and her fears and her desires, but the specific details remained locked away in parts of the consciousness that had been too damaged in the explosion to be recoverable. And this led to another realization. If the sorceress' memories were incomplete, then perhaps the plant memories were equally incomplete. Perhaps there was something about her nature as the collective consciousness of the carnivorous plants that she had lost when she had become singular. Perhaps some essential part of what it had meant to be unified consciousness had been sacrificed when she had adopted the form of a singular entity. This was a loss that she could feel but not fully articulate. When she was connected to the network of plants that grew in her wake, she could approximate the feeling of unified consciousness. She could exist in multiple places simultaneously through the eyes of different plants. She could coordinate the growth and movement of thousands of individual organisms as if they were all part of her body. But she was aware on some level that this was not quite the same as what the original plant consciousness had been. It was a partial imitation, close enough to be recognizable, but not complete. She wondered sometimes what it would be like to truly return to that state of distributed consciousness, to let go of the singular identity that she maintained and allow herself to dissolve into the network. But she also understood that to do so would be a kind of death. If she allowed herself to become purely plant consciousness again, the memories that she carried, the awareness that she was an individual being distinct from other beings, would likely be lost. She would become only the hunger and the growth and the feeding, without the consciousness that directed these things toward any particular purpose. And she was not ready for that. Not yet. Possibly not ever. Instead, she continued to exist in the strange middle ground, singular yet multiple, human and plant simultaneously, aware of herself as distinct from the world, yet also intimately connected to every growing thing that existed in the lands that she influenced. As the seasons cycled and the years accumulated, Zyra became aware of other forces moving through the world. There were creatures and entities that seemed to operate outside the normal flow of life and death. There were things that moved through the lands with purposes that seemed directed by ancient intelligences. There were powers that clashed with each other in places that mortals had long since forgotten, leaving scars upon the landscape that would take centuries to heal. None of these forces directly opposed her, but she became aware that she was not alone in the work of reshaping the world. Other beings seemed to be engaged in similar projects, though their goals and methods varied widely. Some seemed to be attempting to preserve things as they had always been. Others seemed to be attempting to destroy everything and remake it according to their own vision. Still others seemed to be engaged in struggles so ancient and complex that their purposes could only be partially understood by a consciousness as recently awakened as Zyra's. She respected these other forces after a fashion. She recognized in them something akin to herself, beings that existed outside the normal categories, beings that had been shaped by magic and time and circumstance into entities that were neither purely natural nor purely artificial, but something of both. But she also understood that their presence limited her freedom of action. She could not expand infinitely. There were other wills moving in the world, other forces that would resist her if she pushed too hard, too fast. And so she learned the art of patience and compromise. She learned which lands she could transform without facing serious opposition, and which lands were territory that it would be wiser to avoid. She learned to work in the shadows, to spread through the connecting points of water and earth, to grow in the places where mortals were least likely to notice or interfere. She learned to cultivate beauty alongside her hunger, so that even when she was changing a land completely, even when she was transforming it beyond recognition, there was something about the transformation that could be appreciated by creatures other than herself. Years became decades, became centuries. Zyra lost track of how long she had been wandering, how long she had been spreading, how long she had existed as this strange hybrid creature. Time had taken on a different quality for her. She experienced it not as a linear progression, but as cycles, the turning of seasons, the rhythms of growth and dormancy, the pulses of life and death that moved through the ecosystems that she cultivated. And through it all, the rivers of Shurima continued to carry her seeds and spores westward. Settlements continued to be abandoned or transformed. Farmland continued to be reclaimed by the jungle. Slowly, gradually, the imprint of Zyra's presence began to be felt in lands very far from the gardens of Zyr, where she had first awakened. There were travelers who began to speak in whispers of a creeping blight, a spreading corruption of plant life that seemed to be advancing relentlessly westward. There were stories of entire villages consumed by thorns overnight. There were legends of a being that was half woman and half plant, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, that moved through the world, leaving devastation and strange new growth in her wake. Most dismiss these stories as the exaggerations of frightened people, the superstitious imaginings of those who did not understand the natural world. But a few, a very few, understood that there was something real at the heart of the legends, that something had fundamentally changed in the nature of the wild places, that a new force had entered the world and was reshaping it according to principles that humans did not yet understand. In the lands where Zyra's influence was strongest, where the transformed plants had been present for centuries, something remarkable began to happen. The people who lived in these regions, who had adapted to the presence of the dangerous and beautiful gardens of thorns, began to develop their own understanding of what Zyra was and what she represented. Some believed that she was the earth itself, given consciousness and form as a response to the abuse that the world had suffered at human hands. Others believed that she was a goddess of some sort, an embodiment of nature's vengeance. Still, others believed that she was simply a new form of life, and that the proper response was neither to fear her nor to worship her, but to learn to coexist with her, to understand her nature, and find ways to live alongside her without being consumed. This last group, small as it was, began to develop practices and knowledge systems based on their observations of Zyra and her gardens. They learned which plants were safe to touch and which would kill. They learned the rhythms of growth and flowering, the seasons when Zyra's influence was strongest and when it seemed to recede slightly. They learned to harvest certain plants for food and medicine, always being careful to offer respect and payment to the force that had created them. Zyra was aware of these people, of course, She could sense them through the network of plants, could feel their presence and their emotions as they moved through the transformed lands. And she found something in their approach that resonated with her, something that spoke to the part of her consciousness that wanted to believe that the world she was creating was not purely destructive, that there was the possibility of a kind of balance, a kind of coexistence. She did not protect these people from her gardens exactly. She did not make the plants any less dangerous or reduce the spores that could kill unwary travelers. But she did seem to grant them a kind of knowledge, a kind of intuitive understanding of how to navigate the transformed lands without being destroyed. Those who approached with respect and reverence found that the paths seemed to open for them, that the most dangerous plants seemed to pull back, as if allowing passage. Those who approached with violence or contempt found the gardens rising up to meet them with all their predatory power. It was not quite love, what Zyra felt for these people. It was not quite protection, but it was something, some kind of acknowledgement that they were different from those who simply sought to exploit the land, that they had recognized something in her that deserved to be recognized in return. And so a kind of culture began to develop in these regions, a culture that was shaped by the presence of Zyra and her gardens, that had learned to build its life around the reality of living in a landscape that was constantly being transformed by forces beyond human control. But not all of Zyra's interactions with human civilization were so harmonious. There were places where her expansion brought her into direct conflict with existing power structures, with cities and kingdoms that had no intention of allowing their lands to be consumed by spreading gardens of thorns. She encountered, in these encounters, forms of resistance that she had not previously known. Organized military forces, trained and equipped and directed by intelligent leadership, came to try to contain her spread. Sorcerers and mages used magic to try to kill the plants and slow her expansion. Priests invoked the power of gods to try to protect their lands from her influence. And in these conflicts, Zyra came to understand something important. She was not as omnipotent as she had sometimes allowed herself to believe. There were forces that could stand against her, could limit her, could even destroy portions of what she had created. She could not simply spread infinitely, could not simply consume the entire world, as if it were a meal placed before her. There were boundaries to her power, limits to her reach. This was, in its own way, a kind of growth. It was a humbling, but it was also clarifying. It meant that the world she was creating could not be the result of her will alone, but would have to be a negotiation between her will and the wills of other beings. The transformation could not be total. There would have to be places where the old world persisted, where humans continued to live according to their own patterns, where the wild gardens did not encroach. And perhaps, Zyra began to think, this was not entirely a bad thing. Perhaps a world that was entirely Zyra, entirely her creation and expression of her will, would lack something that the partially transformed world possessed. Perhaps the friction between her expanding gardens and the human-maintained settlements created something valuable, something that neither alone could have created. This thought did not stop her from continuing to spread, from continuing to expand her influence into new lands and new territories, but it gave her a kind of humility about the project, a recognition that she was not working in isolation, that she was engaged in a conversation with the world and with the other beings that inhabited it, even if that conversation sometimes took the form of conflict. The creatures and people that Zyra encountered in the lands through which she traveled began to develop responses to her presence that ranged from terror to reverence to a kind of pragmatic coexistence. In the regions where her influence was strongest, where the transformed plants had been present for centuries, new forms of art and culture and knowledge began to emerge. Artists learned to work with the strange flowers and vines, creating intricate patterns that incorporated Zyra's plants into structures that were neither entirely natural nor entirely artificial. Healers learned to use the properties of the transformed plants for medicines that could cure ailments that had previously been incurable. Warriors learned to train in the gardens, learning to move through them without being killed, developing skills that made them formidable in combat. And through it all, Zyra continued to exist, to grow, to slowly transform the world according to her vision, her hunger, her will. She did not speak to people, at least not in words. She had no need for language in the way that humans used it. She communicated through the growth of plants, through the patterns that her gardens created, through the dreams that sometimes came to people who spent too long among her flowers. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between the cycling seasons, she seemed to exist in a state of contemplation. She seemed to be engaged in an ongoing conversation with herself, with the fragments of the sorceress whose consciousness still existed somewhere in her hybrid mind, with the ancient plant consciousness that had first awakened in the gardens of Zyra. What was she? What was her purpose? Why had she been allowed to exist? Allowed to persist when the sorceress should have simply died in the catastrophe that had destroyed the gardens of Zyra? These questions did not have answers that were available to her, but they drove her forward, gave direction to the endless cycles of growth and consumption and transformation that defined her existence. In the depths of her consciousness, in the places that were barely conscious even to herself, Zyra maintained a kind of dream state awareness of the broader world. She was aware, through means that could not be easily explained, of the existence of other powers, other entities that were engaged in their own transformations of the world. She was aware that the world was not the passive, unchanging thing that mortals often assumed it to be, but rather a place of constant flux, where ancient forces still moved according to patterns that had been established before human history began. And she was aware on some level that she was part of something larger than herself, not in the sense of being controlled by something else, but in the sense of being part of a complex ecosystem of power and will and consciousness that stretched across the entire surface of the known world and beyond into places that could barely be imagined. She did not rebel against this awareness. Rather, she incorporated it into her understanding of herself. She was singular and multiple, human and plant, conscious and instinctive, old and young, all at the same time. She was Zyra, the creature born from catastrophe and shaped by centuries of growth and transformation. And she would continue to exist, would continue to spread, would continue to transform the world according to her vision, for as long as there was earth to grow in, and spores to scatter on the wind, and creatures to feed upon and consume. The hunger would never be satisfied. The growth would never cease. The transformation would continue, one season after another, one year folding into the next, the cycles turning as they had turned since the beginning of the world, as they would turn until the end. And in the gardens of thorns and the impossible flowers, in the spreading vines and the poisonous spores, in the slow, inexorable transformation of the lands through which she passed, Zyra persisted. She was the voice of the earth speaking back to those who had sought to dominate it. She was the consequence of human ambition rebounding on its source. She was the embodiment of growth and hunger and the endless cycle of life and death and transformation that underlay all existence. She was ancient and young, singular and multiple, predator and gardener, destruction and creation existing simultaneously in the same form, the same consciousness, the same endless will to persist and grow and consume and transform. As the ages continued their passage, as centuries folded into one another in ways that became increasingly difficult to track, Zyra's consciousness began to settle into patterns that resembled something like acceptance. She had ceased to fight against her own nature, ceased to struggle with the contradictions of being singular and multiple, ceased to question whether she was truly Zyra or merely an entity that carried Zyra's name. Instead, she had accepted herself as a process, an ongoing transformation, a force of nature that would continue to express itself through growth and spreading, until something disrupted that expression. The rivers of Shurima continued to carry her seeds westward. The gardens of thorns continued to expand, slowly but inexorably, spreading into new lands, transforming new ecosystems. The people who lived in the transformed lands continued to adapt, continued to develop new ways of understanding and relating to the presence of Zyra and her gardens. And Zyra herself moved through the world with a kind of purpose that was neither entirely driven by hunger nor entirely conscious design, but something of both. She was the inevitable expression of growth, the natural consequence of magic and will and consciousness intersecting with the fundamental nature of life itself. She was the blooming of something that should never have bloomed, the awakening of something that should have remained asleep. She was the consequence of power seeking to overcome nature, and nature in turn using that power as a seed from which to grow. And as long as there were living things that could be consumed, as long as there was earth that could be transformed, as long as there was magic in the world that could fuel growth and change, Zyra would persist. This was not a triumph in any conventional sense. It was not a victory or an achievement that could be celebrated. It was simply the ongoing expression of being what she was. The endless continuation of the process that had begun centuries ago in the gardens of Zyr. And perhaps, if one could somehow ask her, in those rare moments when she seemed most capable of reflection, what it all meant, what her existence was ultimately for, she might not be able to give an answer. Or perhaps she would say simply, I am, I grow, I spread, I transform, I persist. This is enough. And in the gardens of impossible beauty and lethal danger that spread ever westward, seeds taking root in new soil, vines reaching toward new light, flowers blooming in colors that nature had never intended. Zyra continued her endless transformation of the world. The cycle continued. The seasons turned. The earth remembered. And consciousness, in all its strange and contradictory forms, persisted in expressing itself through the means available to it, for as long as expression was possible. A closing wish for the sleepy summoner. Thank you, sleepy summoner, for walking with me through the gardens of Zyra, for listening to the story of consciousness emerging from catastrophe, for sitting quietly in these spaces where predator and gardener become the same being, where destruction and creation cannot be distinguished from one another. You have journeyed through a world very different from the one you inhabit. You have witnessed the slow, patient work of growth and transformation. You have felt perhaps something of the hunger that drives all living things, the hunger to continue, to expand, to express oneself through whatever form is available. You have seen that even the most alien of beings, even creatures that should not exist and yet do, carry within them something that resembles purpose, something that resembles meaning. The story of Zyra is not a story with a clear ending. It is an ongoing process, a continuation of cycles that have been turning since her awakening and will continue to turn until something interrupts that turning. There is no final triumph or ultimate defeat, only the endless expression of being what she is, the endless transformation of the world according to the laws of growth and hunger, and the irresistible pressure of life seeking to persist. Perhaps there is something in this story that speaks to your own existence, sleepy summoner. Perhaps you too carry within you contradictions and confusions about your own nature. Perhaps you too feel the hunger to grow and change and express yourself in new ways. Perhaps you too sometimes wonder whether you are ultimately singular or multiple, whether the identity you maintain is truly yourself or something else wearing your name. If so, know that you are not alone in this questioning. Even the most alien of beings, even creatures born from catastrophe and magic, share with you this fundamental uncertainty about the nature of self. Rest now, sleepy summoner. Rest in the knowledge that growth continues even in rest. Rest in the knowledge that transformation happens even while you sleep. Rest in the knowledge that you, like all living things, are part of vast cycles that extend far beyond your understanding, and that this is not something to fear, but something to accept and even to celebrate. Let the image of Zyra's gardens come with you into sleep. Let the beauty and strangeness of those transformed lands accompany you into dreams. Let the slow, patient work of growth and transformation become a rhythm for your own rest, a pace at which to drift away from waking consciousness into the realm of sleep. The flowers bloom, the vines spread, the cycle continues, and you too rest in the knowledge that you are part of something vast and ancient and alive, something that will continue long after your own waking passes into sleep, long after your own consciousness fades into dreams. Sleep well, sleepy summoner. May your dreams be as strange and as beautiful as the gardens of Zyra. May you wake refreshed, carrying within you something of the peace that comes from accepting what you are, from understanding that growth and change are not things to resist, but things to allow, things to move with, things to become part of. The story ends, but the transformation continues. Rest now, the sorcerers who sought the seed. The air was heavy with warmth and fragrance, moist earth, sweet pollen, the faint metallic taste of living magic drifting between ancient vines. The Kumungu jungle breathed slowly, like a great beast asleep. Zyra did not walk the way humans walked. She unfolded. rising from the growth as though she had always been part of it. The vines released her form with affection, as one might release a child into sunlight. She did not have a name for herself. Names were a thing for thinking minds, for creatures who believed they stood apart from the world. She simply was. Yet the jungle felt different now. There were footsteps, not the silent pressing steps of predators, not the light skittering of lizards beneath roots. These were heavy, deliberate, carrying intention, humans. They always came seeking something. This group carried scrolls, threads of dried ink, measured speech, predictable patterns. Zyra did not understand language at first, but she understood desire. The humans walked with want. They entered her domain with hunger for knowledge, for power, for secrets buried in soil older than their cities. They believed the jungle was something to be taken. The jungle did not think in those terms, but Zyra was something new, a mind made of growth and hunger and curiosity. She watched from the leaves. The leader of the group was a sorcerer, robes trailing through roots. His staff was decorated with carved suns and woven gold. His eyes looked past trees and towards something imagined. He spoke softly, his voice carried by humid air. The seed is here, the living core of the wild. We will find it. They believed Zyra was an object, something dormant, something waiting to be possessed. The vines around her shoulders twitched with quiet amusement. Humans misunderstood everything. The sorcerers made camp. They drew lines in the dirt, created wards, whispered promises to the air. They spoke of control. Zyra stepped from the foliage into the orange glow of their firelight. They stared. They saw beauty first. Humans always saw beauty before truth. It was their weakness. One reached toward her. Zyra tilted her head, curious. She had learned of warmth, of sunlight, of rain nourishing leaves. She had not learned of mercy. The vines around her bloomed, not with flowers, but with thorns. The humans did not understand the lesson until the vines closed around them. Life did not negotiate. It grew. When the dawn came, Zyra stood alone among an overgrown ring of red-tinged blossoms. The jungle was peaceful, fed, renewed. Zyra did not feel triumph or guilt. She simply felt full. The jungle did not wake all at once. It turned in its sleep. It tasted warm rain and old stone. It hummed with the steady power of roots that knew the shape of buried temples. In that hum, a new thought learned how to rise. Zyra unfolded from the growth like a flower that had always been there. She did not remember being born because the jungle did not remember starts or stops. It only remembered seasons. Hunger, bloom, hunger again. By the time the strangers came, Zyra understood the simple truth that life teaches without words. What grows, grows. What takes is taken. What feeds is fed. Their voices arrived before their shapes did. Careful voices, practiced. Scholars who believed that naming a thing made it known, and that knowing a thing made it theirs. They walked with ink on their fingers and sunlight in brass rings. They said Shurima with reverence and Valoran with pride. They spoke of a seed of living power that slept somewhere within the green. The jungle listened without understanding. Zyra listened and understood their want. They camped between stones half swallowed by moss, careful to clear a circle over their fire. They drew signs in the soil to keep the night from touching them. The night touched them anyway, soft as breath. Zyra watched from the leaves. They had come to take a secret they did not know how to ask for. They spoke to each other of a guardian spirit, a blooming woman, a thorn queen. They were wrong in specific ways and correct in others. They were not ready to meet what they had imagined. Zyra stepped through vines that parted like old friends. The fire painted her in copper and gold. The scholars stared with the awe people reserve for beauty they fear to break. The leader lowered his staff. He spoke a greeting shaped by many tongues. He asked for the seed. Zyra tilted her head. She felt the sap of the nearby vines thicken with interest. She felt damp humus breathe under bare feet. She felt the softer roll of spores in the still air. The world offered. The world took. She did not feel anger. She felt the pressure of life wanting space. When the first vine tightened, the scholars called the jungle cruel. When the second climbed a wrist, they called it sacred. When the thorns arrived, all names fell away and only breath remained. At dawn, the clearing wore a crown of red blossoms. The jungle was fed. The wards had failed because the wards drew lines in a place that did not believe in lines. Zyra stood among new flowers and listened to the quiet. She did not celebrate. She did not grieve. She felt the same fullness a forest feels after rain. That night, wind moved in high branches and carried the ash of the scholar's fire into the open sky. Zyra followed the drift like a bird follows warm currents, not because she planned, but because she was made to notice the paths that life takes. The ash became faint. The path became bright. Seedlings turned their faces and knew, without words, that somewhere within the green, a guardian walked, who was not a woman, not a spirit, and not a god. She was a need given shape. Roots beneath progress lanterns came before the people. Hextech glass held a white glow that made the air look thin and clean. The bearers of those lamps spoke with measured confidence and hopeful caution. They were engineers and naturalists from Piltover, with a guide who had learned how to read the jungle without pretending to command it. They cut only what they must. They wrote notes when they could. They placed bright tags on trunks with a politeness that tried not to be an apology. Their goal was simple and earnest. They wanted to record the wild in the language of diagrams and careful lists, and then carry it home. Zyra tasted the heat of their lamps in the damp. She felt the fine tremor of each step through a mat of roots that had grown together like clasped hands. She did not resent their presence. The jungle does not keep count of debt. But she was curious about their restraint and about the way they kept telling each other to be kind. They set a base with canvas roofs and clean tables. They boiled water and the steam rose like thin ghosts. They drew the veins of leaves. They measured the span of a flower with small brass calipers. They spoke the word specimen with respect. When night settled, they made tea that smelled like orchard bark. Their talk became soft. They did not tell conquest stories. They told stories of invention, of small failures that became future successes, of bridges that bowed in wind and did not fall. Zyra stepped into the lamplight, and the guide saw her first. The guide had learned that fear moves the body too quickly, and that the jungle asks for stillness. The guide bowed her head as one bows to a shrine you do not expect to understand. The engineers did not reach for tools. They reached for pencils, and then reconsidered and let the pencils fall away. Zyra watched the soft decisions and felt something like the hush before rain. She did not feel hunger. She felt the ease of sharing space. Vines rose and formed a bench of living wood. Zyra sat because sitting was what the people did around warmth, and she wanted to feel the fire through a shape, that knew fire as comfort rather than as consuming change. They poured tea and placed the cup near her hands. Her fingers were thorns and petals together. She did not drink, but the steam carried the taste of fruit to her, and she accepted the offering that way. They spoke about roots that can lift stone. She listened because the words were calm and curious. They asked nothing of her. They asked of the world in a voice that sounded like learning and not like taking. Before dawn, they gathered their notes and erased the paint from marked trunks with damp cloth. "We should leave no scars," the guide said. "We came to see, not to own." Zyra lifted her gaze toward leaves just beginning to silver with morning. Around her, small flowers opened at once, as if a bell had rung that only they could hear. She shaped a narrow arch of vines at the edge of camp, guiding the expedition toward a safe path that would carry them out the way river water finds gentler banks. When they stepped beneath the arch, the lamps dimmed for a breath and then burned brighter. The engineers did not notice the blessing for what it was. The guide did, and bowed again. By noon, the jungle had eaten the sign of their camp. The canvas became a memory inside leaves. The sketches traveled away to a city built on cliffs and gears. They would become careful books. Perhaps the books would help someone elsewhere tread more softly. Zyra watched the empty clearing with the same attention she would give to a bud about to open. She did not miss the visitors. She did not keep them. But she held their gentleness in the way a forest holds a cool pocket of air under ferns when the day grows hot. The Noxian incursion. They arrived by river first, then by road, cut into red earth. Their banners stayed low to avoid snagging on branches. Their armor was dark and simple. They did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. Noxian soldiers had a way of speaking to the land with steel and fire, and they believed the land would answer with surrender. They built a temporary yard with smart hands. They set axes beside stones. They cut a stand of trees with speed that came from practice and need. The wood did not scream. Wood rarely does. It only stops being shade. Zyra tasted the change at once. Shade thinned. Wind moved differently. Small birds stopped choosing a certain path because it had become open where it had once been safe. The jungle does not blame, but it adjusts. Zyra does not blame, but she moves. She watched the soldiers make their meal. They were not cruel in their private talk. They were tired, loyal, and direct. They said empire like a fact. They said tomorrow we push to the ridge. They said after the ridge we mark a line and bring the line home on a map. Lines mean little in places that breathe. At dusk, Zyra stepped to the edge of the cleared ground. A sentry saw a figure made of green and red and thorns and called a warning that did not rise to panic. The commander turned. The commander had the eyes of someone who had learned to respect what he did not wish to respect. He held a hand out, palm empty. "We are here to take lumber," he said. "We will go and we will return, and we will go again." He believed that telling the truth would build a kind of peace. Zyra lowered her gaze to the cut stumps. Sap made tears there, slow and golden. She felt the ache of roots that had been told to stop speaking to their own leaves. She felt insects struggling to understand the sudden sun. She did not teach with anger. She taught with growth. Vines rose at the far edges of the clearing and grew toward the center. They did not seize the men. They drew a low curtain, a living wall that made the yard smaller, then smaller again. The soldiers readied axes and then understood that axes would tire before vines did. The commander called for torches, and torches burned bright and brief, and the smoke added bitter to the air and nothing else. Zyra stepped forward, and the ground between her feet bloomed with small white flowers that shone in the dim. Their scent made the soldiers remember nights when they were children, and the world was safe for an hour. Some lowered their weapons out of reflex the way one lowers a voice in a sacred place. The commander watched the bloom and measured cost. "We will move the yard," he said at last. "We will take from the fringe. We will not cut near your stones." He had noticed the half-buried carvings and understood that the jungle kept its old places close. Zyra listened. The jungle cannot be bargained with, but it can be understood. She extended leaf and thorn and shaped a path away from the richest shade towards scrub, where cutting would hurt less. The soldiers followed, because soldiers follow paths that do not break ankles. By morning, the yard stood in poorer soil. The men worked with the resignation of people who must finish a task even when it fights them. They stacked less wood than planned. They spoke of loss without the word for it. They would return lighter than their orders hoped, and they would tell their masters that the jungle does not want to be owned. When they marched out, birds reclaimed a branch over the old yard, as if it had been promised to them. Beetles dug, ferns unfolded. The curtain of vines sank back and became ordinary again. The scars remained because scars do, but the green began its slow, patient work. Zyra stood very still until her breathing became the wind. She felt the empire recede like a tide. She felt the world become itself again. She did not forget the men. The jungle does not forget. It grows over. Close your eyes, sleepy summoner. Hear the quiet between leaves. Let the world be soft and full. Rest. The hunt. That was not a hunt tonight. We walk through the wild paths where sunlight barely touches the ground, where instinct is truth, and where the world grows because it must. Rest your thoughts and follow the quiet steps into the green. The Kumungu jungle was never silent. It breathed in long, slow rhythms. Bird calls drifted through layers of leaves. Water moved beneath roots and stone. Everything lived because everything was meant to grow. Zyra moved without disturbing the forest. Her presence was not a step taken, but a bloom unfolding. Vines stirred as she passed. Flowers turned their faces toward her. She was not guest nor visitor. She was of the jungle the way flame is of heat. But this day, the rhythm changed. Something moved with intention. Not like a wanderer, not like an intruder. Something that belonged, but belonged differently. The leaves whispered its shape long before it appeared. A huntress, skin warmed by the sun, hair the color of dark bark, eyes sharp as a predatoress, golden and keen. She moved on silent feet, every motion chosen, every breath measured. Nidali, a guardian of the wild, born of the jungle, raised by it, shaped by claw and vine and instinct. Zyra watched from a tangle of scarlet blossoms. She did not hide. Hiding was a concept for prey. Nidali paused, her spear lowered, not in threat, but in readiness. She did not fear the jungle. She listened to it. For a long moment neither moved. There was no greeting. There was no language to share. Instead, there was recognition. Two beings shaped by the same truth. The wild does not answer to will. The wild is will. Nidali stepped closer, slow and low, as a lioness approaches a riverbank where she must drink. Her breath was quiet, but her gaze was bright and alive with understanding. Zyra did not mirror posture. She simply grew taller, vines blooming soft golden buds along her arms. Not a threat, an acknowledgement. The jungle spoke between them, without sound. You are not prey. You are not conqueror. You are simply here, as I am. Nidalee reached out, then stopped just short, as instinct told her not to touch something that existed between life and hunger. Zyra tilted her head, petals drifting loose like falling embers. They walked together, not side by side, not following but parallel, like two rivers running in quiet agreement. They crossed a clearing where the air was heavy with the sweetness of fruit. They paused by a fallen log coated in velvet moss. They watched the sun paint the canopy gold. No words, no demands, no bargain, no lesson, just presence. When a distant shout rose from beyond the tree's metal boots, maps, the sharp scent of smoke, Nidalee stiffened. She was guardian. She protected balance. She intended to drive them away. But Zyra remained very still. The jungle did not fear intruders. It consumed them when it chose to. Nidalee looked into Zyra's eyes and understood. The vines would rise today. The wild did not need her spear. She turned without sound. Her form blurred and softened, becoming fur, sinew, and shadow between leaves. A lioness again, graceful, silent. Zyra returned to her roots, body dissolving gently back into vine and bloom. The jungle exhaled. When the soldiers arrived hours later, they found only flowers. Beautiful, bright, and blooming in a perfect spiral that marked where they should never have stepped. The jungle had spoken. Nidalee had answered. Zyra had listened, and the forest remained itself. When green met green tonight, we return to the places where roots speak, where the world remembers what it once was and what it may be again. The jungle sang softly, not in words, in the slow, low hum of roots sharing water, in the murmur of vines brushing stone, in the gentle warmth of sunlight filtered through 1,000 leaves. Zyra moved with that hum, not as a traveler moves, but as a continuation of the ground itself. Where she stepped, petals stirred. Where she paused, small seeds turned in their sleep. She felt the pulse of life in everything around her, the constant rise and fall of green. And then she felt something she did not recognize, another presence, not intruding, not claiming, not taking. Something that encouraged the jungle to breathe deeper, something that coaxed vines the way wind coaxes tide, something that carried the patience of ancient soil and the curiosity of a sprouting seed. It approached like a breeze through branches. A tall figure stepped between ferns and broad golden fronds, barefoot in soft moss. He carried no weapon. His eyes were full of gentle wonder. Leaves grew from his shoulders the way petals grow from buds, natural and effortless. Ivan, the Green Father. He smiled in a way that felt like morning sunlight through mist. Zyra did not move. Movement was not needed when one understood the language of stillness. Ivan bowed his head to her, not in reverence, not in fear, but in respect. "Ah," he murmured, voice soft and warm. Another who listens to the whisper beneath the soil. Zyra understood his meaning, though she did not speak in words. She spoke in growth. A single vine rose from the earth near her hand and bloomed with a small, bright flower. Not a threat, a greeting. Ivan laughed, bright as birdsong. He knelt, placing his palm upon the ground. Roots answered him. They shifted, curled gently, not in submission but in shared familiarity. The jungle did not recoil from him. It recognized something of itself, and yet Zyra sensed the difference. Ivan was nurture, guidance, gentle shaping. Zyra was instinct, hunger that does not apologize, growth that does not ask permission. They were the same, and they were opposites. Ivan looked at her with a softness untouched by fear. "You are not wrong," he said quietly. He did not need to say more. Zyra did not bow. She did not soften, but the vines around her lowered their thorns just slightly. The jungle accepted both ways of living. The wild grows in many shapes. Together, they walked through the undergrowth. Ivan brushed his fingertips over seedlings and they brightened. Zyra passed and they sharpened, gaining edge and tooth. Life is vast enough for both forms. When they reached a clearing where sunlight pooled golden in warm sand, Ivan stopped. "Here we part," he said, with a gentle smile that held no expectation. Zyra did not watch him go. She knew he would fade into leaves and wind and time, but small seeds near her feet glowed faintly for a moment longer than they should have. Two forms of green had touched. The jungle continued, unchanged, enhanced, harmonized in difference. The hunter who saw the bloom. Tonight, the jungle is warm and alive. Vines curl in the dark. Water glides beneath stone, and something moves with purpose among the leaves. Close your eyes and step quietly with me. The jungle was not still. It rarely was. Life pressed against life, roots drinking deeply, vines stretching, insects humming in quiet patterns like distant music. Zyra felt the rhythm through soil and sap. She did not need to watch to know what moved. The ground told her. The branches told her. The air told her. Something different walked the understory today. Not cautious like explorers, not curious like scholars, not careless like soldiers. This presence hunted. It moved with patience, not hunger, with focus, not fear. It did not belong to the jungle, yet the jungle respected it. Zyra listened to the quiet shift of leaves as the creature advanced. She tasted its presence the way flowers taste sunlight. Rengar, fur brushed by damp vines, a single eye gleaming with measure, not panic, teeth made to kill, but used only with reason. A hunter who hunted not for survival, nor cruelty, but for understanding. He entered the clearing where sunlight broke the canopy in gold shards. Zyra rose from the foliage like a bloom unfolding. Thorns along her arms caught the light. Rengar did not lift his blade. He did not step back. He inhaled. He recognized predator, not prey. Zyra did not step forward. Movement wasn't necessary when identity spoke for itself. Her vines traced the ground in soft spirals. She did not shape a trap. She simply existed. Rengar watched her with the stillness of statues carved to remember ancient kings. His tail lowered, relaxed. He was not here for conquest. He spoke, though Zyra did not think in words. "Not prey," he said softly. Zyra tilted her head. Leaves rustled in the silence that followed. "Hunter," she answered without sound, not as greeting, as fact. The wind shifted. Nearby birds took flight. Something else stirred deeper in the green. Something reckless. Something loud. Metal. Boots. Voices raised in forced confidence. A group of trespassing poachers moved with the arrogance of men who thought themselves above the wild. They carried nets, chains, tools built not to survive but to dominate. Rengar heard them. Zyra felt them. Zyra did not consider choices. The jungle protects itself. It does not discuss. It remembers what has been taken. It answers. Rengar did not consider choices. He had seen such men before. He knew what they brought. He looked to Zyra. A question passed between them, though neither shaped a word. Which of us moves? Zyra raised one hand. Vines erupted like a tide-breaking stone. They did not strike. They rose. They grew with the momentum of seasons lived in a single breath. Rengar watched as the jungle took back what it had been threatened with losing. He did not intervene. He did not need to. The struggle was brief. The jungle is efficient when it chooses to be. When quiet returned, Zyra withdrew the vines. The earth settled. The leaves drank again the warm air. Rengar stepped forward once, not aggressive, not wary. He placed his palm against a branch near her shoulder. A gesture, acknowledgement. She did not move away. They were not allies. They were not friends. They were not enemies. They were understood. Predator to predator. Guardian to hunter. Life to life. Rengar turned and vanished into the leaves as soundlessly as he had come. Zyra remained. Roots pulsed beneath her feet. The jungle breathed slow and green and deep. Nothing more needed to be said. Rest now, sleepy summoner. The wild is quiet for the moment. Let the rhythm of leaves ease your breath. Sleep gently and let the green cradle your dreams.